Wauwatosa School Board to order. We are in the basement boardroom of the Fisher Building. We will begin this meeting with a moment of silence. Mrs. Galante, please will you call the roll?
Mrs. Fee?
Here.
Mr. DeRose?
Here.
Mr. Kroner?
Here.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Here.
Mrs. Randall?
Here.
Mrs. Weber?
Here.
Mr. Meyer?
Here. Members of the Wauwatosa School Board value the input of students, parents, staff members, and community members. The board's regularly scheduled meetings provide an opportunity for opinions and concerns to be expressed publicly. The board values all comments and will respectfully consider this input in decision-making. The board requests that individuals limit their comment on each item to 3 minutes. Following any comment, an individual board member may respond on the issue raised. However, it is not the intent of the public comment portion of the agenda for the board to enter into a debate with members of the community. Because non-agenda items are not publicly posted in advance, no action will be taken on public comment regarding non-agenda items this evening. Is there anyone present who would like to comment on a non-agenda item? Seeing none, we will move to approval of the consent agenda. Are there any items on the consent agenda which board members would like to remove for separate discussion or action? Seeing none, may I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Mrs. Randall moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Mrs. Muehlfeld seconded. Is there any discussion on the consent agenda in general? Yes, Mr. Kroner.
I just have a couple of questions. It has to do with approval of the previous minutes. Something that was added prior to after our last meeting was something that we had discussed at the meeting, and that was a list of the charge of the negotiation compensation committee. And I just want to ask a couple questions about that. There are, I think, 5 bullet points. In the bullet point 1, it says the committee shall assist the superintendent and represent the full board in bargaining. In the past, the board has met and discussed bargaining limits, and then the negotiation committee went and did negotiating. I understand that this committee will do some preliminary discussion about the bargaining recommendations, but is it my understanding correct that we will still meet in executive committee and decide as a full board how to proceed with negotiations before the negotiation committee negotiates?
Yes, that's my understanding about what the path is. Mr. Droz could specifically speak to it, but I know there's a target date where they're attempting to get a date for bargaining with the bargaining units, and they're back scheduling to get in the meetings necessary in order for them to get organized, for them to come to us, and then for them to go to the negotiation session.
Okay, good. And the next point, it says the topics and questions for consideration by the committee may be either policy questions presented by the superintendent or originated by the committee for answer. Is it also possible for topics to be presented to the committee by the board, if a majority of board members would like a topic investigated?
It's at the discretion of the committee. You could present it to Mr. Giroux and see if they wish to bring it up, or if it's not desired by the committee to take up the topic, you could present it to me for discussion by the full board. So it looks like there's 2 paths available now for that to happen. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So if we had a discussion on a particular topic and 4 or 5 board members would like to refer it to committee for further consideration, that is one avenue for giving topics to the committee.
We could refer it to the full, we could refer it to the committee. We could bring it immediately to the full board. We don't want to be working in parallel on the same topic, of course. I think we can work it out. If there's a topic that any board member feels needs to be discussed, then we'll try our best to get it agended somewhere,
Okay,
you know,
that's fine.
so that it ultimately ends up before the full board. I'm making this up as I go here, so, you know, does it sound, you know, reasonable, what I've just said?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that that the full board had the opportunity to give topics to the committee to address if something came up that the board wanted to do. And that the sole power to work in that committee didn't reside simply with the board committee chair or the superintendent.
Well, they're in control of their committee, and if we wish to refer something to them, we may. And if we may wish to take it up ourselves, we may do that as well. I suppose in a hypothetical sense, it's hard to say exactly how any particular question will go until we know precisely what the question is. I would consider whatever reasons there are for having a committee, and that would drive the determination about whether it would go to them first.
So if we had a discussion at a board meeting and 6 board members decided they would like something like a particular aspect of benefits to be reviewed, the committee could still decide to not review it?
Well, I'd call Mr. Giroux and see what we thought was the most productive path for the particular issue. I don't see a problem. It depends upon the nature of the question. So I'm trying to answer your question. If I'm not, then keep asking questions.
I guess I'm finished.
Okay, all right. Any more discussion? Mrs. Galante, please will you call the roll on the motion? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Mrs. Fee. Is there community comment? Seeing none. Now, Mrs. Galante, please will you call the roll on the motion?
Mrs. Fee?
Yes.
Mr. Giroux?
Yes.
Mr. Croner?
Yes.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Yes.
Mrs. Randall?
Yes.
Mrs. Weber?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes. Recognitions. Mrs. Muehlfeld, please.
Thank you. The Wisconsin Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports Network, or PBIS, recognized 6 Wauwatosa School District schools for their tremendous work accomplished through the implementation of PBIS. 4 Wauwatosa District schools were selected as schools of distinction from 25 schools statewide. They are East High School, Madison Elementary School, Roosevelt Elementary School, and Washington Elementary School. 2 Wauwatosa School District schools were selected as schools of merit from 114 schools statewide. They are Lincoln Elementary and Underwood Elementary. The Wisconsin PBIS Network is a Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction funded initiative. PBIS is a proactive approach that establishes safer and more effective schools and is currently being implemented in approximately 40% of Wisconsin schools. Criteria for the School of Merit category included scoring at least 70% on a benchmarks of quality, regular staff and team self-assessment of implementation for action planning, leadership from both internal and external coaches, and using the Big 5 data reports for problem solving around data. In keeping with the rigor of the PBIS framework, schools were required to demonstrate at least 11 or 80% of the School of Merit components in order to be recognized. To be identified as a school of distinction, schools were required to meet 11 of the 13 criteria for schools of merit. In addition, schools had to score at least 80% on a benchmarks of quality, describe positive outcomes attributed to their PBIS implementation, and describe parent-community involvement, classroom systems, and disaggregation of data in their PBIS implementation.
Students from Wauwatosa East and West High Schools received exemplary solo award certificates from the State Music Association. The Exemplary Solo Recognition Project expands recognition of outstanding soloists at the WSMA State Festival. The students are, at East, Isaiah Simmons, string bass, Benjamin Bauer, cello, Sidney Rakowicki, alto voice, and Maddie Walensky, concert snare drum. At West, Aaron Stapleton, music theater, female voice, At the 2012 WSMA State Festival, judges identified 465 exemplary soloists from 9,000 solo events of approximately 12,000 total qualifying events. Prior to qualifying for state, the 465 soloists earning exemplary honors were among more than 220,000 students who participated in 60,449 events at WSMA district solo and ensemble festivals across Wisconsin.
Okay, thank you. Action items, human resources. Mrs. Fee, please will you read the motion?
It is recommended that the school board approve revisions to policy 3422, administrator benefits, as discussed at the June 11th board meeting, and I so move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Croner. Is there any board discussion or questions? Is there any community comment or question? Seeing none, Mrs. Galante, please will you call the roll?
Mrs. Fee?
Yes.
Mr. Giroux?
Yes.
Mr. Croner?
Yes.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Yes.
Mrs. Randall?
Yes.
Mrs. Weber?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes. Next action item, student learning. Mr. Croner, please will you read the motion?
Number 1, elementary and middle school science resources. It is recommended that the school board approve the elementary and middle school science resources in the amount of $413,584 as presented and discussed at the June 11th board meeting, and I so move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. Fee. Dr. Ertl, I see we have a handout. Is there any kind of presentation tonight that was planned, or is it based on what was said at the last meeting?
Based on the previous
Okay.
presentation.
Is there any board question or comment? Is there any community question or comment?
Mr. Meyer, if I can just make a comment. A couple of things. In the past 2 weeks, I've had the opportunity to interview 2 new science teachers that will be teaching both at the middle school level. And in my discussions with them about moving in this direction with science, both of them were extremely enthusiastic and pretty excited about the direction we're going. And I just want to say thank you to Mrs. Ehrenberger and all the effort she put forth this past year to get us to this point. This is a transformational science program, and I think it's going to put us in an extremely positive place, and I think there's a lot of people excited about it, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in the next several years with this science program.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Croner.
Just have one comment. As I stated at the previous meeting, I'm really pleased with the work that was done. I think this is going to be a really strong thing for the district to put through. But what I would like to suggest is that when we implement this program, that we officially schedule a year from now just a report on the implementation itself, and that hopefully at that meeting we'll hear that everything went well and new things that we tried we can add to implementations for other programs, or things that didn't go so well we can either fix or know that we have to change for other implementations. But I just hope that a year from now we can officially schedule just an implementation report so that we put in major programs like this of this cost, that we have just a more regular mechanism for just monitoring how it's going in the district. But overall, I'm very happy that we're moving in this direction.
Okay, thank you. Is there any additional comment or question from the board? One more time, any community comment or question? Seeing none, Mrs. Galante, please will you call the roll?
Mrs. Fee?
Yes.
Mr. Giroux?
Yes.
Mr. Croner?
Yes.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Yes.
Mrs. Randall?
Yes.
Mrs. Weber?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes. Motion passes. Is there any public comment on non-agenda items? Seeing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Thank you, Mrs. Muehlfeld. Is there a second?
Second.
Mrs. Randall? Mrs. Galante, please will you call the roll?
Mrs. Fee?
Yes.
Mr. Giroux?
Yes.
Mr. Croner?
Yes.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Yes.
Mrs. Randall?
Yes.
Mrs. Weber?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes. 7:15, we are adjourned.